When we're talking about cell communication, some of the key things that you all need to know is that this is essential for organisms. Communication is key for organisms to maintain homeostasis. It's going to involve transduction of either stimulatory or inhibitory signals. These can either be from other cells, other organisms, or even just the environment. Survival of cells is going to depend on them receiving and processing that information that they're getting from outside of the cell. So, an example could be information about environmental conditions. In order for the cell to survive, it needs to be able to receive and process that information and make the necessary adjustments. Another example would be nutrient availability. The cell needs to know about nutrient availability so that it can then adjust itself so that it can maintain homeostasis. Right, cell signaling. So cell signaling is going to involve three main components. We're going to have a ligand, the signaling molecule, and a receptor protein, and that's what the ligand is going to bind to. Now, ligands are signaling molecules. The most common ones are going to be hormones and neurotransmitters, and we'll actually come back to these in more detail later. So our ligands are going to bind to receptors, and that is going to trigger the response. Now, receptors, the location of the receptors is going to depend on the type of ligand. If we're working with hydrophilic ligands, the ones that cannot cross the membrane, the receptors are going to be located on the cell membrane because hydrophilic ligands can't go through the membrane, so the receptors need to be on the membrane so that the ligands do not have to cross the membrane. If it's hydrophobic ligands that are small enough to cross the membrane, the receptors that work with those are going to be inside of the cell. These are known as intracellular receptors. And the hydrophobic ligands have to actually cross the plasma membrane and they bind to the receptors inside of the cell. We're going to look at the methods of communication. We're going to look at unicellular first, and then we'll look at multicellular. So an example for unicellular that we're going to focus on is going to be bacteria. Bacteria are going to communicate via a process known as quorum sensing. This process involves the detection and response in the bacteria species to environmental signals. It helps them locate mates. It can help them adapt their metabolic rates with changes in their nutrient availability. It allows them to communicate with members of their species, monitor their population density, and control their gene expression. It's not just within the same species, however, because universal quorum sensing is going to be a form of communication between different species. Now, all of this process, their methods of communication, or them being able to communicate, it helps to regulate horizontal gene transfers, and it also is what allows the transformation of regular bacteria into the virulent strain of bacteria. Let's talk about multicellular communication. So this is going to be a little bit more in depth because when we're referring to communication in multicellular organisms, it is going to be more complex because these are going to be organisms that are communicating with one another to coordinate activities of the organism as a whole. They are multicellular, so all of these different cells need to communicate with each other to coordinate all of the activities for the organism. Now, methods. The specific method for communicating is going to depend on the distance between the cells that are communicating. So let's start with the closest to each other. Direct cell-to-cell signaling. So this is going to require direct physical contact between the cells during communication. Something that is going to play a large role in key vocabulary for this is going to be gap junctions and plasmodesmata. Now, these are the passageways that are there for materials to move from the cytoplasm of one cell into the cytoplasm of the adjacent cell. So our gap junctions and plasmodesmata, these are what's going to allow the cells to transfer those signaling molecules that are transmitting their current state of homeostasis with one another. So key thing to knowing when it is direct cell-to-cell signaling could be these vocabulary words if you see gap junction or plasmodesmata, or another thing could be that they mention that they are touching. All right, the next type is paracrine signaling. So this is going to be our signaling that involves cells that are close to one another but not in direct contact. Okay, so as you see, your messenger molecules are going from one of our cells to the next that has, and the second one has the receptors on it. Now cells are releasing short-lived signals into a localized area, so that right, localized when tell you that it's nearby, and that induces changes in a nearby cell. Key thing about this is that these signals are only going to be able to diffuse over relatively short distances. Now, growth factors and clotting factors, these are common paracrine signaling agents. Growth factors is going to be the release of signals to nearby cells that gives instructions to those cells on growing and dividing. Next one, synaptic signaling. This is going to involve three main components: specialized nerve cells, neurons, and target cells. In synaptic signaling, we're going to have neurotransmitters released by a neuron into a synapse to either stimulate an adjacent neuron to fire or a muscle to contract. Next one, we've got endocrine signaling. And now this is going to be where we're looking at signaling with cells that are not really close to each other. So these are cells that are far apart. So in endocrine signaling, these are going to be longer lasting signals, and the most common example that you would need to know for endocrine signaling are going to be hormones. So these are released into extracellular fluid. So for this instant right here, the example, we've got the bloodstream, and they will travel widely throughout the organism to the target cells. So in endocrine signaling, we are actually using other components to help us carry those signals to where they need to go. We've got two types of main hormones that we want to really look at. One is going to be protein hormones. These are large molecules that will bind to receptors that are on the cell membrane. The other type is our steroid hormones. Now, steroid hormones are lipid-soluble molecules that can pass through the cell membrane. So these are going to bind to intracellular receptors. So remember that we looked at steroids when we talked about our biomolecules, and they were a component with our lipids. Now, last one, we've got autocrine signaling. The cell is going to send a signal to itself by secreting something that in turn binds to a specific receptor on its own membrane. So use that word auto. It is sending the signal itself and it's binding to it itself. Now, autocrine signaling is going to play an important role in cell development and our immune system. All right, this is an important type of signaling in both development of cells as well as the response from the immune system.